on 7. I think that's good enough. And then you've got a pencil here. If there's anything you want, if I ask you anything that should remind you of something, then we can go from there. Tish, why don't you begin at the beginning and tell how you started off in the White House. When I last remembered you, you were leaving Tiffany's to go abroad and start a business of your own. And when I came back from Indonesia, there you were, ensconced in the White House. Can you go back to that period?
Well, that's true. I was spending 6 weeks in Big Sur on top of a mountain in a lonely, remote spot, writing a novel, and ready to go back to Tiffany's and finish up and open in January my own business in public relations in Milano. And one day I was working at my typewriter and a long-distance call came from Hyannisport. This was roughly 6 days after John F. Kennedy had been nominated by the Democrats for the presidency. It was
6 days after the Los Angeles convention.
Yes, after the termination of the convention.
Yeah.
And it was Jackie, and she said, if Jack makes it, you've got to come and be social secretary at the White House. Well, I was in an absolute stew with that. Told her I couldn't possibly, I was opening my own office, and she said, now don't be hasty, just think it over. So she had called me back in 2 days. So of course I put down the phone and did about 1 hour's thinking, and then realized, of course, it was something I couldn't turn down. And so I started work in December for the Kennedys. And my most exciting memory is that I worked on the inauguration, of course, helping get all of the family together. I took over the White House cars right from the Eisenhower administration and got everybody to the inaugural events.
In the snow? In
the snow. Terrible frustrations, but the White House garage drivers became my first friends. And at 12:05 on Inauguration Day, when everybody else was down on Capitol Hill seeing all the exciting events, I paraded into the South grounds with Provy and George the valet.
Who was Provy?
Provy, Mrs. Kennedy's marvelous maid, and the inaugural ball gown and all the suitcases. And we had made this pilgrimage from Georgetown to the White House so that we would not arrive before 12 noon, because at 12, officially, the new president takes possession of the White House. And so we officially took possession at 12:05. It was the most beautiful, sunshiny day, and we drove through that driveway. The whole south lawn was covered with white snow, and the blue sky against the White House. I've never seen the house look so beautiful. And there was the head usher and all of the staff inside the front door, waiting to receive us. And so we had a very busy afternoon while everybody else was being very inaugural and watching parades and things. We were already at work, changing the house over. Then Mrs. Kennedy and the president walked in at about, it was about 4 o'clock. And we had another party, our first party in the White House.
That afternoon?
Reception for all the families. And this was a lot of family. When you get all the Kennedys, all of the Bouviers, Auchinclosses, the cousins and the stepsisters and stepbrothers and the nieces and nephews, I think our guest list was about 130, all in all, at that party.
Well, now, Tish, when you came down to Washington, what plans did you make before starting? Did the Kennedys have any particular ideas about life in the White House that they conveyed to you before they came into the White House? Did you have sort of think sessions or planning sessions once the president's election was assured and you knew that this was in fact going to be your job?
Well, both President and Mrs. Kennedy spoke a great deal about her side of the house. They both realized what a very important side of the presidency the First Lady is. And they spent a good deal of time making notes. She wrote copious notes. She relayed these to me and showed what a fantastic sense of organization that she had. She already had thought out the main basic problems and the basic organizational patterns before they walked through the doors in January. And as I say, she arrived at all of this with thorough discussions with him.
And the president was interested then in the running function of the White House.
Intensely interested. He was always interested in everything, but he was smart enough to know what an important job she would play in his life. And there was no nonsense. I mean, this was a young woman who had really never had a professional life before, except a short experience working as an inquiring photographer. But the great professional sense of organization was immediately apparent. It was a great relief to me because she was a friend, and I was so glad that here was an organized mind and a very efficient mind.
So that you really knew where you were about and what your goals were as you came in that beautiful snowy day.
That's right.
While all the rest of us were glued to our television sets watching the inaugural address.
That's right.
You had other things, but...
And they had already discussed what they would do historically for the house.
Well, now I
Already.
recall that an announcement was made, I think 2 or 3 days after the inaugural, saying that an attempt at a historical renovation would be made in the rooms before the project was really fully formulated, or had it been fully formulated before then?
They thought a great deal about it before the inauguration, but it was only after they were in that naturally she undertook to organize the committees, and line up Mr. DuPont, and line up the other members of the committee. It also evolved logically from these first few meetings with the people who really ran the project. And she got a curator right away.
That was Mrs. Pierce, wasn't it?
Mrs. Pierce, through Mr. DuPont. And there were lots of problems that one couldn't foresee immediately, which grew out of these various meetings. Worries about getting the people's presence tax deductible. Do you have to make the White House a museum? What do you do about legal suing and all of these? There had to be lawyers and Justice Department officials and tax experts and everybody brought in. It became a gigantic project, needed a big staff, and of course that evolved.
How many were there working on it, Tish? Was that a full-time partitioned assignment for somebody else, or did that fall into your bailiwick?
Well, we handled all the correspondence at the beginning, but it just grew to be too much for us.
It must have been monumental.
We just couldn't handle it with all the other correspondence we were handling. So a whole separate department grew up under the White House curator, and it was really a part of the Department of Interior.
I recall that, yes, when the thank you certificates were sent, they were,
yes,
as I recall, came with acknowledgement from the
legal
Department of the Interior.
responsibility was shifted over to Interior, which was just as well, actually.
Well, Tish, when you were ensconced in your office, can you give me some idea of what a typical day was? How did your...
In the White House, there is no typical day.
Every day is different, and every day is bedlam, I suppose.
Every day is bedlam. The summertime, when they were both away on vacation or something like that, we'd have a moment's peace. But there really wasn't peace then, because we were knee-deep in Christmas, planning for Christmas. There were lots of things which had to be planned 6 months ahead. Then there were the emergencies day to day. I remember writing a memo to the president saying, Mr. President, you called my office, somebody from your office called my office this morning and said there would be 28 for luncheon this noon. We got the word at 11 a.m. and you told us that people were coming at 1 and they actually came at 12:15 because somebody else told them 12:15. Then I plaintively said, we really can't run a house like this. The food was lousy, the service was lousy, and we just can't go on like this. And he scribbled a note back to me on my note and said, when the time comes when I know 6 months before we're going to have a party, I promise to let you know.
Touche.
I realized that we were going to be in for the impromptu meals from there on in. And
well, did the president use the White House in an impromptu way that way, in the sense of using the home facilities? Was he wont to suddenly call and say, I'm bringing in people?
Yes, he would entertain. If there was some sort of crisis going on, whether it was labor, a bunch of newspaper publishers would suddenly arrive, whatever it was, he would organized. He would move fast. According to what the situation demanded, and if a meal was called for, well, a meal was prepared. But the chef learned to roll the punches, and the staff did, and we finally got out of our long advanced planning psychosis. Certainly on a state dinner you have to have lots of advanced planning. You cannot throw it together because there's so many little frills that are essential. But on the President's Stag entertaining, we just learned to make do with not so many frills. The men didn't notice the difference anyway.
No, I don't think they do. And anyway, once the chef's mentality has been corrected, then the basic problem is licked, I think.
She was very aware of how necessary a note of distinction is in the White House in entertaining. And he said it too the first day he came in. He said, we really ought to have the nicest entertaining here with the greatest distinction, and whatever it is, I'm counting on you to work towards it.
Was this the standard that the President set for the staff at the White House? He was interested.
Oh yes, he was interested in perfection in every department, and he was like a wonderful department store manager who goes through the department store and knows everybody's name and knows how all departments work, and knows how to wrap packages better than the wrappers in the wrapping department. He was very much of a merchant in running the White House. He was a very good administrator. He cared, and he would stick his nose into people's departments and call them up and find out what they were doing and what they were up to. And those stories about his picking up mail on people's desks is absolutely true.
How often did he come your way, Tish?
He didn't come physically our way very much, but he called us over a lot. I got summoned to his presence often and would go over with fear and quaking. Sometimes it was to give me absolute help for something I'd done wrong and to demand an explanation, and sometimes it was to praise us for doing a good job. Sometimes it was just to pick the old brains on a female point of view on something.
Well, Tish, can you give a sample? Can you reminisce about some of the interviews that had you with trembling knees and the others that you came away with a glow?
Well, I remember the first time I ran a counter to him was very early in the game. On Sunday, January 29th, which was very close after the opening days in the White House, we gave our first public party, which was for all the presidential appointees and their families, all the special assistants, all the bigwigs, the cabinet officers. We had it in the East Room. We had a Marine band, and we asked a certain press pool, and without further ado, I simply ordered good cocktails and very good hors d'oeuvres. Now, the usher's office informed me that under the previous regime, they just didn't serve hard liquor at these parties. They served a spiked punch or a fruit punch. And I said, oh, well, the Kennedys want to entertain well. They wouldn't hear of that. So I simply surged ahead and had a bar put up in the dining room and another one in the East Room. And very good drinks were served, and it was a great party. Well, the next morning's papers screamed, liquor in the White House, bars in the White House. Nobody talked about anything else. This was the whole news. And the WCTU got after the president, and every Baptist Belt congressman started complaining. And finally, the president called me up about 3 days later in an absolute rage. What did you do to me? Why did you do this? For Christ's sakes, your life isn't hard enough. And I said, well, Mr. President, you said you wanted a good party, and I just arranged it that way. And he said, well, the next time, give us the choice of being able to say, all right, we will do something horrible by having the liquor served, hard liquor served, but don't just simply suddenly do this behind our backs and leave us open to all of this. Well, he really dressed me down. And about 8 months after that, I passed him in the corridor, and he said, I've been meaning to say something to you, Tish. And I said, what, Mr. President? And he said, the fact that you put one over on us and served hard liquor that first party, and we've been serving it ever after, was the greatest thing that's ever been done for White House entertaining. It's relaxed the whole thing, and you've proved it to be a success, and I just want to say thank you. So that's one reason we loved him so much. He always remembered to as well as dressing us down, he always remembered to compliment us too, even when we didn't deserve it. So.
Tish, I think you crashed a sound barrier of some sort. if they've served liquor ever since, you made the
Yes,
shattering precedent, I
you
suppose.
can't serve hard liquor to 1,500 people when you're having a big reception because the budget won't stand it. So that's when we go back to the old spiked punch and the fruit punch. But a party is not a party without liquor. People, orange juice and tomato juice is always served. Sherry is always served, and anyone who doesn't want hard liquor
Has
doesn't,
something else.
Of course.
Yeah.
Very touchy point, though.
Well, Tish, with the president obviously enjoying his parties, I've never seen him at a White House function when he didn't seem to be really enjoying his role as host and doing it superlatively. Can you recall to mind any of the state visits that caused particular excitement, where the guest was particularly interesting to the president and where he wanted to do something special, or whether you worked together with him on plans and with Mrs. Kennedy on plans? What would come to mind?
Well, they took a great deal of interest in every state visit. Two of them were great psychological strategists, and it was really the state visit, the preparation which they did for it was biographical. They both wanted personal notes on the people, and we would collect that from several sources.
You mean as to the visitors'
From
tastes?
the State Department, from CIA, from the ambassador to that country, from any place we could get it, even the New York Times files, about their idiosyncrasies, their special likes and dislikes, and particularly notes about the family life, which both President and Mrs. Kennedy had a great facility for memorizing, so they would come crashing forth with some little detail about a great-granddaughter or a cousin who studied in America for 1 year in 1932 or something. They knew all that, and it would come forth, which flattered the heck out of the state visitor.
So the president had a dossier then?
Yes, he had a dossier, and he would discuss it with her and vice versa. And so we fed them as much information as possible. Then the state gifts, which the Kennedys gave, they drove us all crazy each time getting all these ready, because there were so many gifts that we had to give to the state heads, and particularly when we went abroad on a trip. You had to give gifts to every mayor of every town, his wife, his children, the heads of state, the heads of the foreign ministers, their wives, the lady in waiting if there was one, all of these various officials who fulfilled certain functions in the state visit had to get a little memento of some kind, right on down to the squad police escort drivers and the motorcyclemen. Well, the Kennedys cared very much about who got what and it being appropriate, and his sense of history came forth. He always really made the decision on these state gifts, and he leaned towards the historical.
In other words, you would produce a series of possible gifts.
That's right.
And he...
That's right. We all ferreted out things that we thought would be good. Historical letters from a place in New York City, and historical paintings and lithographs which pertain to the country from various galleries in New York and Washington. And then I found once an old flag, an Irish Brigade flag, which had been used during the Civil War by an Irish Brigade here in this country. So he liked that very much, and we got that to give to the President of Ireland.
Very appropriate.
Then he and Mrs. Kennedy spent a great deal of time deciding how it should be presented, how it should be framed, encased in glass, what the plaque should say, and he, being such an historian, insisted that the plaque tell the whole story of the flag. And he made me check and recheck. He said, I think that sounds fishy. Something wrong with your facts. Get your facts straight. I had to keep calling up the people in New York for the society to get the text right for it. And always a presentation case in leather would go with the gift, whether it was an etching or a flag or an old print or whatever it was, telling the whole story and how that tied our country up with a foreign country. Well, this meant a great deal. It always had an enormous impact. And then we, for example, the president wanted to be sure that the French gifts were also fine, and they were. The mayor of Paris got a big Vermeil box with the map of of L'Enfant's original map of Washington engraved
Oh,
on the
stunning.
top, and things like that, which he really thought up himself.
In other words, before the presentations were made, it wasn't just an aide passing him a box in which he was to make his presentation.
Oh,
he knew
no.
about it.
He knew about it. He usually thought it up himself. He would get us to do research to ferret things out, but he often had the idea first himself. And he went right down the line of every single gift that was given, right down to the lowliest motorcycle driver, or waiter, or maid in the house where they were staying. He checked every single thing off to be sure that it was right.
Well, Tish, what was the first great state dinner that you had? I recall the one where you had the Shakespearean play when the Premier of the Sudan was here, but then there was the beautiful one out of Mount Vernon, which I believe was the Pakistani state visit.
Well, the first one, we had a lot of state luncheons and cocktail parties and things like that spring, but the first real state dinner, all out, was May 3rd, 1961. President of Tunisia and Madame Bourguiba. And the President and Mrs. Kennedy decided that it would be great to have a military display on the lawn. So they said, you arrange it. So I got the military aides of the president, and we arranged about, I don't know, a complement of 300 men performing intricate maneuvers and Scotch bagpipers and various things. The president came out of his office when we were having a rehearsal, and he said, "Where are all the men?" And I said, "Well, Mr. President, there they are." There were 250 or 300. He said, "Oh, well, that's not what I meant at all. Oh, we got to have a lot of men, and good-looking men, good-looking young American men. And I want lots of good-looking Negroes in there, and I don't want any young American boys with glasses on. I want them to all look like they've got marvelous eyesight, and I don't want any fat bellies." So we went and we raised it to 1,000, and he came out again when we were rehearsing them along. He said, "Where are all the men?" I said, "Mr. President, there are 1,000 out there," and he said, "It's not enough." Well, we ended up with something, I don't know, we had 2,000 or 2,500 on the lawn, and this finally satisfied him. I realized that then and there that this was someone who really loved military pomp and splendor, and the skies, searchlights in the skies, and marching men coming out of every imaginable tree, and bands in all directions. It was an absolute, it was really a scream. Of course, the military aides were holding their heads.
The logistics for 2,500 men on the White House lawn.
That's right, that's right. But the Tunisians were impressed. Then, of course, the Pakistan dinner, that was one of the worst headaches that any office ever had to contend with.
Well, this was the first time that Mount Vernon had ever been used, as I recall, and special permission had to be obtained from the Ladies' Society.
Oh, yes, and they complained, too, the Ladies' Society. The president kept asking how the Mount Vernon ladies were coming along, as plans progressed, with a twinkle in his eye. The logistics involving that party were so enormous, because here we had let me see, how many people did we have? 137 people, with more in after dinner. So there were really about 80 guests involved in all, plus an enormous amount of manpower. We had to have the Marine Band out there. We had to have all the Marines lining the drive coming up from the pier up to the actual house. We had to have the National Symphony Orchestra and build them a special stage and perform after dinner. We had to worry about the acoustics. We had to worry about feeding the musicians, getting them out there and feeding them. We had to worry about portable johns, and where to hide them in the bushes so it wouldn't ruin Mount Vernon's
the aesthetic effect. What about the weather, Tish?
We worried about the weather. I gave orders to my whole staff to pray. I don't care whether they went to a temple, a mosque, or a Catholic church, or a Christian Science temple, anything, to get down on their hands and knees and pray. And we did. We prayed for 6 weeks solidly, and it worked. They sprayed there was a terribly buggy summer, and they sprayed 3 times that day against the bugs and mosquitoes. We had a tent put up with a flooring to put the tables on, And Gene Moore, my old friend from Tiffany's, the window designer, came
Oh,
down
yes,
and donated
yes.
his services and did a fabulous job of decorating the inside of the tent with garlands and festooning it. It was all done in yellow and blue and green. It was really a beautiful sight. Um, we went out and rehearsed several times before. It was great fun for those of us who actually ran it, because we would go down the Potomac on these various boats that were going to take the guests down. We went down, once I went down on a PT boat, once I went down on the Honey Fitz, and once I went down on the Patrick J. We had little orchestras on board each boat. We had to try out the hors d'oeuvres. We had to try out the logistics of whether you could serve mint juleps on the bow of the PT boat with the spray coming over, and we had to worry about getting scarves and sweaters for the ladies, because it's very deceptive. It gets very cold on the river, even on a hot night, and they were all used, I might add, the scarves and the sweaters that we brought down. We had to worry about doctors and ambulances, because it is a kind of a place where if you had a heart attack, you're miles from nowhere. It came off without a hitch. The guests were taken down the river. A beautiful night, a hot July night. When the Pakistani, when the boat stopped opposite the landing of Mount Vernon, and the music came forth, and they played the Star Spangled Banner, and all the military men stood at attention saluting Mount Vernon. There wasn't a dry eye on the river, and even the Pakistani were undone by that. And then the guests were driven up in little White House cars up this long winding road up to the Mount Vernon piazza there. And we'd had a terrible time rehearsing this, because the Marines are so brave and unflinching that the cars just drove right over their toes. We had them on both sides of the line, the driveway. And the cars, we started up the hill in the cars, and we were literally running over their feet. They didn't complain. So we stopped.
Driveway for the
we
modern
took off one whole side of Marines and plunked them closer together, and so they lined just one side of the driveway and didn't get their feet run over. We had the redcoats, the Army riflemen, the President's own, as it's called, in their colonial uniforms.
Was this a particular tribute to the President?
The President really loved this, because this little ceremony took place in front of Mount Vernon, in front of George Washington's house. Ayub Khan, they were standing there, and at the end of the drill, the redcoats took their muskets and fired, blank ammunition. But the press corps just happened to be standing exactly in the direction of the bullets, so that in actual fact the redcoats shot right into them. And President Kennedy started to roar with laughter, and Ayub Khan, he said to President Ayub Khan, "That's the press corps." And General Ayub Khan said, "I'm so glad, that's just what we would have done in our country." So the two men had a wonderful time, and President Ayub Khan knew what this meant, what the Kennedys were doing for him. And it was really a brilliant night. The President was in his element, and so was Mrs. Kennedy, because things went off so well.
And I take it that they both love the beautiful panorama and display, and both are rather sociable and love parties and people and friends and events.
They did. They loved, and they were perfectionists, and they knew when it was going right. They set a feeling of warmth and ease in all of their entertaining, which was very catching, and people would come to the White House in fear and trembling, because it is an austere place, and usually they'd have a couple of drinks before they'd come to get their courage up. But immediately the whole atmosphere changed. They were at ease, and found that it was a good party and lots of attractive people and pretty surroundings.
Well, I think the sense of humor that you point out in the President must have aided a great deal to make these things a little less grim and deadly than they have been in former administrations, when the crushing formality and the sort of boredom of it all was...
Oh, yes. Well, another thing that we did right away, which had never been done before, was handle this ghastly time between the time that the guest arrives in the East Room waiting to be received by the President, and the time that the President and the First Lady actually come downstairs and stand in the receiving line. Up until the Kennedy administration, nobody ever got a drink. And they stood there with their hands tied for anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, just standing, waiting to be received and sort of scared to death. Now they're given a drink, and then it's taken from them. The trays are passed. When the President and Mrs. Kennedy would appear, the butlers would pass amongst the guests and pick up all of the glasses, so that the receiving line was done with great dignity and there wasn't a sign of alcohol around, but the guests were already feeling it was a party and they were feeling good. Then they would go right off the receiving line right into the dinner table.
Well, Tish, what about the actual state visitor? As I recall, they would come downstairs from the private quarters with the president and his
Yes.
wife, that they had been received upstairs.
That's right. This was a sort of a personal touch. The state visitor and his wife would come up to the private quarters, and there Mrs. Kennedy would have very cunningly put out all the gifts which that foreign visitor had given them, right outside the entrance to their little private living room. So both President and Mrs. Kennedy would discuss the gifts, how much they enjoyed them, how great they were, and how the signed photograph will be on our piano forever, and so forth, pleasing the foreign visitor enormously. Then they would go in and have a quiet cocktail with the Secretary of State, Mrs. Rusk, and perhaps the Dukes, the Chief of Protocol, and the ambassadors of the two countries and their wives. Then, at a certain moment, I give the order to the head of the color guard, and he would come upstairs into the yellow room and say, "Mr. President, may I take the colors?" Something of that nature. The President would nod, and then the color guard would form right outside this yellow private living room. President and Mrs. Kennedy would come behind with the chiefs of state and the various official guests, and they would all come down the stairs in a grand march, get their pictures taken at the bottom of the stairs and into the East Room to be received, to do the receiving. We had to work this out because it was a question of getting a photograph of all of them together. It was a question of making a very formal, exciting entrance to the East Room. There were all sorts of things to be considered, so we worked that out as a formula that succeeded very well. The President, the first year, he was always so impatient and always moving off fast. Once he got started, he got started. And it was terrible trying to teach him not to walk off until the first strain of Hail to the Chief, trying to teach him to stay still for the photograph. I think he always, once he got started, he wanted to move. And the social aides, the young social aides, were much too nervous to grab a hold of him and physically bar his way. Or if he started going in the wrong direction, he'd go into the dining room and he was supposed to go into the East Room. And so I used to run after him and grab him. And so early in the game, he said, "I've got a new name for you. It's Miss Push and Pull." But when Mrs. Kennedy wasn't with it, when he was on his stag things or she was away or something, and that we had these march down the stairs, it was always, we'd go into a different room, they'd have to go into the blue room first or into the red room. He learned to look over and catch my eye, and I would make the old sign with the head and the eyes, and he would go in the right direction. The first time he had a stag luncheon, I can't remember who the person was. It was some African president. He came down the elevator from down to the first floor, and I heard the doors open, and he said, "Now, Mr. President, we have a very handsome house." And with that, he walked straight ahead right into the butler's pantry, where they were preparing all the cocktails, and they were wandering around in their shirt sleeves and aprons. And all of us clutching after him for having gone into the wrong room. And then he said to me, as he walked unceremoniously stopped and said, "Well, this isn't quite where we're supposed to be." And then he said to me, "Maybe after a few more months I'll learn this."
Learn the floor plan of the house. Well, in effect, he did learn the floor plan and produced some really spectacular evenings. Tish, what about the innovations, the idea of having music and art and drama in the White House? Was he actively interested in, for instance, the Shakespeare productions that came?
Oh, yes. Mrs. Kennedy, he relied on Mrs. Kennedy's imagination and good taste, and she always discussed it with him, and he always had a smart idea. If something wasn't right, he would have a good idea of how to make it right. He was very interested. The
What
program, he went over the programming when the Shakespeare program was on. We had a very fine performance by our American Shakespeare Theater from Stratford on Avon in Connecticut. And let me see, who was that for?
It was Ayub Khan, I think, of the Sudan.
No,
wasn't it?
Ayub Khan is Pakistan.
Oh, sorry, yeah, it would be...
It was, yes, it was President Ibrahim Aboud of Sudan, that's right, October 4th, 1961. He wanted to know exactly which excerpts were going to be done, because he said he didn't want blood flowing all over the stage. For an African president who might be in fear of his own position in the country. And he knew his Shakespeare, and he passed on every single part that they were going to be doing. The things that threw him were concerts. He never knew when the concert was over, and he never knew whether to clap for an encore or not. So he said to me one day, he said, you gotta figure out something to do about this, because I'm left with egg all over my face. Last week I got up at the wrong time and congratulated the performers, and you should have this figured out for me. I can't follow the program on this. So, because they often did perform one encore or two encores, and he just didn't know which was what. I don't blame him myself. So we figured out a thing where when the thing was definitely over, he was to keep on clapping, and when the thing was definitely over, I would open the big doors into the East Ballroom wide, and then he knew that was the end, and he would spring up and congratulate the performers. As often, this would occur when Mrs. Kennedy wasn't with him to spring up, and she always knew
when it was going to be over.
Yes.
Well, Tish, when you entertain at the White House, there are times when you entertain for family and friends as well. It couldn't all be official. I take it the same rooms weren't used, and the same care and thought was not given to the details.
Well, Mrs. Kennedy cared very much about the food for her friends. She really worked hard on those menus, and it was always done though in the upstairs quarters, the family quarters, which were much more cozy, and the children were running around. Of course, the children were always a part of their life, official and non-official. And one of the greatest hits made with the state visitors was having the children introduced to them, having the children playing around.
It's a great icebreaker too, I think.
Great icebreaker. Nobody can resist children, particularly the little Caroline and John. And they were great celebrities in their own rights, and everyone was always fascinated to see them, so that the president of Sudan could go back and talk to his grandchildren about Caroline and John Kennedy and what they said and what they did. So even on stag lunches, where Mrs. Kennedy didn't participate at all, the president would always make sure that she would be there with the children at lunch, even if she had just come in from playing tennis or whatever it was. She would greet them, the children would greet them, and there was a tremendous little family scene always, which the president knew was important in relaxing his state visitor.
I can remember one story of a rather serious meeting taking place one evening in the White House, and it was Halloween. And the men had just concluded a very lengthy and serious debate and were picking up their papers when all of a sudden there was a tap on the window glass, and 5 or 6 little masks all going whoo whoo were outside. And I'm told that the president feigned mock alarm and signaled to everyone else to be afraid too, and let the children in.
I remember hearing that story. Oh, he was so close to any children. He was really marvelous. One day I had my nieces. They were then ages 9 and 11. I was taking them through the White House, and there was a buzz, the familiar buzz came on the ground floor elevator, meaning the president was coming on his way from the private quarters over to his office. So I said, Alice and Jeannie, let's duck in now. You mustn't let him see you, but we'll duck into Dr. Tavel's office and hide behind the door. So I really hid myself behind the door because I didn't want the president to see his staff playing hide and seek in the hallway. And I let Jeannie and Alice peek out behind the door as the president strode by. I knew he had Prime Minister Karamanlis with him and a lot of the Greek ambassador, and they were having a very important meeting. So out of the elevator came the president, accompanied by at least 12 other men. He saw these two little red-headed noses, and freckle-faced noses, peeking out of Dr. Terrell's door, so he threw open the door, and then he found me hiding behind it too, and he said, "For God's sake, we have games around here." And then he said, "Who are these?" And he stopped and talked to Alice and Jeannie Baldridge, just undoing them and making them burst into tears of excitement after he'd gone. And he kept all the men waiting in the corridor while he talked to these two little girls, just because they were children. And another time when he really did move not only me to tears, but the White House police guard. He'd been late in his office. He was held up with a labor meeting or something, and he was due at the State Department auditorium for a press conference at 2 o'clock. And the House kept calling over saying, "Mr. President, your lunch is getting cold, your lunch is getting cold." They wanted him to have something to eat before he went to the press conference. He'd been working so hard. Well, he finally started over to get some lunch at 1:30. And he saw a group of us out in the garden. These were all spastic children in wheelchairs. And he came rushing out into the garden, and these children, I couldn't understand most of them. Their minds were all right, but their speech faculties had been very heavily affected by their ailments. He talked and talked and talked and listened until he could understand what the children were saying. It was absolutely incredible, the patience he showed. And one little boy had been in a PT boat. His father had been in a PT boat squadron. He got that out of the child. Now this I never could ever have understood. The child and he had a great rapport, and the president went back into his office and got one of his old PT boat hats and put it on this pathetic little boy's head. Well, it was the most touching scene, and there was the car. It was 5 minutes of 2, and there was the car to take him to the State Department to the press conference. So he stepped right into it. He missed his whole lunch. There was no press around to record this, and there was no chance of any votes being gotten by this, but it showed the real humane side of this man and his great love of children. And the White House policemen were, they had some tears in the old eyes. We all did.
These were spastic children that had been brought on a special visit to the White House.
Yes, on a special tour, and they never expected to even get into the Rose Garden, much less see the president. I mean, it was never any question of it. But it's something that, for their whole lives, and for their families' whole lives, that's something they'll remember and treasure.
Well, Tish, this man evidently had tremendous vitality and tremendous interest in the everyday things of life, as well as in the great pressing affairs of state. And I think that it's quite astonishing how he can learn to compartment himself for both, rather than being totally involved by the burdens of the office.
Well, I think that this is one of the things that kept him on even keel. His interest in everything helped refresh him and get his mind off of some of the weightier problems. The East Wing really did amuse and fascinate him. And he used to love the war that used to go on between the East and West Wing. We were always fighting with Pierre Salinger or Kenny O'Donnell about our rights and privileges, because the men in the West Wing would just simply go ahead and plan things, including Our Lady, and walk all over us. And I'm not the shy type, and Pam was, but she learned not to be the shy type. So we fought back, and the president, this amused him enormously. Sometimes we would complain in memos saying, "Now, we can't stay this way, it can't be this way," and he would always take our side. And on the days, the fine spring days, when the swimming pool door was open, many of the time I'd be walking from West Wing to the East Wing, and he would call to me, and I would walk in through the door. He'd be doing his exercises, and he'd say, "Now, what's with East Wing now? What are your problems today?" And no matter how small or insignificant the problem, he wanted to hear about it. And he always got us out of some of our really big problems. I inadvertently got Mrs. Kennedy into a war with the whole DAR on 2 occasions, and he had to extricate me from it. And
how, Tish? Was the war about the famous chairs, or?
The first war was the fact that we did not receive them in the White House for their annual convention. It was so unpleasant, I just don't want to go into it. The second war occurred when one of my pet charities, UNICEF, Children's Fund, was attacked by the DAR as being a communist front, and the women of America were exhorted not to buy their Christmas cards, which was their sole fundraising activity, because this would be putting money in the hands of communists, or some such palaver. Well, I rose in anger and talked to Kenny O'Donnell and said, listen, don't you think it'd be all right if Mrs. Kennedy bought a couple of hundred of UNICEF Christmas cards right this very minute and we released it to the press? Kenny said, I think it's a great idea. So without further ado, we did it. Now, Mrs. Kennedy was totally innocent in this. This is the kind of thing that I really didn't have to bother her on. And she suddenly became the butt of an enormous war because the DAR rose in furor and anger. This was really ruffling their hide. And, well, and then, of course, I just don't even want to talk about it.
But how did the president extricate you? He was entertained and fascinated by all of this, but how did he get you out of it?
He found a very neat little gesture we could make to the DAR to sue them down, which if these tapes were to be released 100 years from now, I would tell the whole story, but let's just leave it right there.
Tish, I think you're being very elusive. Here I want to get a very ingenious and nice gesture.
Well, let's leave the DAR where it is. After all, the DAR was a very cogent political force and will be a cogent force in many years to come.
Oh, it will, but I don't want to leave the president in the swimming pool. I think we've got to get him out of the swimming pool. And we talk of times of crisis and of his never being too busy with a personal touch. He had some terrific crises coming up in the early years. And can you recall for me the man at the time, say, of the Cuban crisis at the time of the Bay of Pigs? Did he disappear? Did you feel tension and atmosphere in the White House but never see him, or was he there?
When he was in the middle of a severe crisis and was really intensely worried, he would blow off steam in our direction, and we knew it. We came to expect it. He would abruptly lose his temper, and without giving a chance to answer back or defend oneself. This occurred. I remember during the first Cuban crisis he called up to complain bitterly about the menus and got very angry, and then his sense of humor really came around, and it ended very well. But he called up to say that, now this was when he was working day and night on the Bay of Pigs, that he'd heard from several congressmen that we were getting too Frenchy and too international. Why weren't we more American? That nobody could read and understand the menus. We had a state visitor coming up who spoke. I think it was the King of Morocco. I can't remember. Somebody who spoke French as his regular tongue, other than his own native tongue.
You had Senegal, I think, that fall coming up.
It may have
yes,
been. It may have been.
It may possibly be.
So he said, now I want this menu entirely in English. I just don't want any more criticism in this house for being too French. And I said, all right, Mr. President, but it's just impossible to do. And he said, you're always arguing with me. You say it's impossible. Just why? Let's just take a menu. Let's just take a menu and I'll show you how it's possible. This is the way he was. He really did know people's business better than they knew it himself. So I said, all right, Mr. President, let's just take a menu. I remember it to this day. We start out with potage au vermicelle. And he said, all right, what the hell is that? And I said, all right, it's consommé with little things squiggling in it. And he said, well, you can't describe that in English very well, can you? And I said, no, you can't. He said, all right, call it, instead of potage au vermicelle, he said, call it consommé au vermicelle. Anyway, they all understand the word consommé. Some of the congressmen will. And I said, yes, all right. Next course. Mousse de saumon, sauce normande. He said, well, call it salmon mousse. I said, well, mousse is a French word, Mr. President. He said, well, how would you describe it not in French? And I said, well, it would be, we could always say salmon with gelatin. He said, oh. And then sauce normande, we could always say sort of a green mayonnaise sauce. He said, it sounds terrible. I said, well, we'll have to leave it sauce normande. Then we get to Noix de veau printanier, the next course. He said, what's that? And I said, well, it's a heart of veal with vegetables all thrown around it. He said, oh, call it noix de veau printanier. Then we got to salade verte and fromage assorti. And he said, well, that's easy, you can call it green salad and assorted cheeses. And I said, that's the one point I concede you on. And the last thing was a dessert, a very rich, elaborate dessert, which was surprise délice or something au chef. And he said, well, describe it, don't just call it that. And I said, well, all right, mounds of whipped cream with shaved chocolate on a rum base. He said, oh, he said, I give up. Just forget I ever called. And hung up the phone. But he had momentarily detracted himself from affairs of state, blown off some steam, and then had a good laugh on it. And we would always get calls from him on little household matters like that when he was undergoing great pressure. That's one way he kept on an even keel.
Somewhere to.
But he showed tension in his face and in his manner and in every way. But he did have a wonderful capacity for blowing it off. Marvelous capacity.
Tish, what were the things that he was most interested in the running of the White House? What kind of detail did he particularly enjoy? The ceremonial? Or
yes, he cared very much about the ceremonial part, and we developed various formulas. For a stag lunch, it would be run one way. For a state lunch where there is a man and woman, it would be run another. For a state dinner, it would be run another. And for receptions, we had 2 or 3 patterns. And always we used lots of flags. For certain occasions, we would get the cadets down from the Army, West Point, and so forth. He and I used to have a secret little pact about the Marines. We both loved the Marines, and we knew that they looked better in their uniforms than any of the other services did. So we used all Marines to line the drive every state dinner. And then we used to work little deals that only he and I knew about. When the Winston Churchill ceremony was on, and this was going on Telestar, and Winston Churchill was receiving an honorary citizenship in the United States. The President cared very much about that ceremony, and he threw the whole thing in my lap to plan, which was very exciting for me. The Telestar thing was coming on at a certain hour, and I found myself back in the President's office with governors and cabinet officers and everybody out of line. They had to be in line, and he said, oh, here goes Miss Push and Pull again. And I'd get them all lined up for their entrance out. Everything had to be timed just so, and then they'd start getting out of line. They'd see old friends, and he said, you're really having a hard time. And so he turned around and he said, now listen, everybody pay attention, Miss Baldridge, and just get in line. I loved him for that. But we worked out a little thing where on the steps we would have framing the ceremony so that it would be in the Telestar photo lens. We would have all these marvelous looking Marines, including one very fine young Negro. So the other services were all represented, and we had the Army, the Navy, and everything, and the Air Force, but they never really looked as smart and as snappy as the Marines did. But if the Winston Churchill ceremony, you really got a full blast of Marines, and during the whole ceremony. These little things we planned. It was favoritism, there's no doubt about it.
Well, I think that's very entertaining. Tish, why don't we take a break for a second here? Tish, I think we'll resume after our brief break to refuel here with some delicious Kroll coffee. When we think back on the president, all of us I know have an image of a vital, attractive person, a wonderful campaigner, a very personable man. Can you tell us any of the stories about his charm and his sociability, meeting groups that came to visit the White House or dealing with groups as such?
Well, he really was the most tremendous charmer of any groups. I saw him in action raising money for the National Cultural Center, which is now called the John F. Kennedy Center of Performing Arts or something like that. He invited a group of mostly Republicans. They had all the money. And he gave a speech and so undid them and charmed them all that they all dug deep in their pockets to contribute to the center. One day we had the Sacred Heart alumni, thousands strong, who took over the whole house for a morning public tour. Mrs. Kennedy was out of town. Ethel Kennedy was pregnant and sick, and so was Joan Kennedy, pregnant and sick. So we were left without any Kennedys to represent as to be hostess, and they were bitterly disappointed. The president was in the middle of some crisis, and I managed to get a note into him over everybody's objection in his office that there were no Kennedy ladies around, and the Sacred Heart were there, thousands strong, and very disappointed. Well, he came rushing over, gave them 5 minutes of his time, told them mentioned off every cousin, aunt, niece, everything who'd ever attended the Sacred Heart, and he knew all the Sacred Heart locations, and said, after all, you ladies, you're the best looking group of ladies in the world, and it was my honor and privilege to come and speak to you. Well, he totally, the whole house was in a just state of frozen adulation, but he had that way with people, and never disappointed groups. He used to upset the Secret Service because of his security violations. The first year we had a foreign students reception, he was mobbed by some 4,000 young people, and a lot of them were hotheads, Iranian students who had been demonstrating violently in front of the Iranian embassy, and there were lots of conspirators rumored about. They were very nervous, so the next year, since everyone had misbehaved so badly the year preceding, we developed a series of ropes whereby he would come up onto the Marine bandstand, make his speech of welcome to them, and then walk around a series of ropes so he could walk around the whole South Lawn and see everybody and shake hands across the ropes, but he wouldn't be knocked over.
In fact, you were going to rope him off from the gathered
Yes.
students, I see.
So it started out, he went about 4 feet rather, along the rope, and then he just agilely ducked right under it, right into the thousands of foreign students, and the Secret Service lost him until 35 minutes later. They had no idea where he was. You couldn't see him. He was being pushed, shoved, his tie torn, everything. He couldn't have cared less. He felt great, enormous excitement and pleasure from that, from being close to them and answering their questions. And they shot some of the worst questions at him too, insulting questions, but he took them all on single-handedly. And they really were impressed by that, because in their own countries, many of these countries, the African, Arab nations, their leaders are always followed by machine gun cars and so forth, to armored tanks, so this was quite something to have him mingling amongst them so freely.
And ironic, really, that he should meet his death in a situation where the security precautions were total.
I know, this is one of the great ironies of history, but I guess World War I, the way it started, I think this will go down as one of the great ironies, certainly, of history, with all the elaborate security measures that have always been taken for his movements, and the way he used to transgress against them freely, worrying the Secret Service, and then to have been assassinated in a carefully planned security trip is unbelievable.
Well, Tish, you told me some time ago that March 17th was a memorable date in the White House.
It was my first knowledge of how you cannot really push the president too much. It was our first St. Patrick's Day, and Mrs. Kennedy had just produced John Jr., and the Irish ambassador arrived with a special silver christening cup, which was a gift from the people of County Wexford, where Ambassador Kennedy's family came from, President's ancestors. This lovely silver christening cup was to be presented by the Irish ambassador to President Kennedy in front of all the television cameras and whatnot. Well, I got wind the morning of the presentation that Irish Airlines was really getting in on the act. The girl who was going to hand the cup to Ambassador Kiernan was an Irish Airlines stewardess in uniform, and Irish Airlines was going to wave the banner. They'd flown the cup over and so forth. Well, having been aware of how the minute anybody in the Kennedy family gets on a foreign aircraft, the screaming and the yelling from the American airline company, you know, you have to take our airlines and so forth, I realized this was going to turn into an Irish Airlines commercial. So I told the public relations man that she was going to have to get into a regular dress, get out of her uniform, and that she would just be introduced as an Irish girl from Wexford County, and that's all there was to it. We couldn't have all this advertising. So the president wanted to know in the next room as he was getting ready to walk in just who was going to be there, and I mentioned this Irish hostess, and I said, well, I made her take off her uniform, and this was going to turn into an ad, and so forth and so on, but we handled the situation perfectly. So he gets into the ceremony, the cameras grind away, the Irish ambassador recites his charming poem, christening poem for John Jr., takes the cup from the young girl and hands it to the president. The president looks right over at me and thanks the ambassador for the lovely gift, thanks to the people of Wexford County. He said, but the most important thing of all is that this cup was flown here courtesy of Irish Airlines, and this young lady here is a hostess, a lovely young hostess for this marvelous airlines. And he went on and gave them a 5-minute commercial himself, looking right at me as if to say, you see, you just can't tell me what to do, what not to do. So his Irish blood was boiling. And we did get enough letters, I might say, from the domestic companies after this little incident to fill a whole scrapbook.
You can plan some things, but you can't plan everything.
That's right.
Well, Tish, obviously, planning and lots of planning was part of your job and part of your life at the White House. We haven't talked about the trips abroad, which must have involved more planning than almost anything. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the grand trips that were so successful and were such brilliant personal as well as political successes for the President and Mrs. Kennedy?
Well, every one of them was a brilliant success for President and Mrs. Kennedy. The first one was Canada, and this was the first time that the President really saw the power of Mrs. Kennedy. The Canadians were screaming Jackie, Jackie in the streets, and the Canadians just don't scream that way normally. And all of the members of the government told us very proudly that they both received a greater ovation than Queen Elizabeth had on the previous visit. And this kind of an admission is really something,
I should say.
But this was the beginning of her popularity, and I think he really looked at her with new eyes on this occasion. She took far too many suitcases and hair dryers and whatnot, and he was impatient. The first trip with all of this extra stuff along, but then he realized it's all a very important part of her image of impeccable grooming and beauty and style, and he was very proud of all of the lavish descriptions of praise of her personal appearance. And so I think he put up with all the suitcases and confusion and the hair being washed with great equanimity after that. Paris, of course, he was so overcome by her popularity that he was forced to make that wonderful statement, I'm the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris, as his introduction to himself. I'll never forget doing the advance on that. I went over to Paris about 10 days ahead of President and Mrs. Kennedy and took care of the social entertaining side, their party which they were giving at the embassy for President Madame de Gaulle, Mrs. Kennedy's schedule, which involved enormous planning, every step she took, what gifts she would give to Madame de Gaulle's charity, who would get the signed photographs, the disposition of the rooms, and all of these things. And I stood in the Palais d'Orsay, the Quai d'Orsay, where we all stayed, on the balcony and watched the procession coming across the Place La Concorde with the marvelous Garde Républicaine on the horses and those wonderful steel helmets glittering in the sunshine and the long plumes waving behind, and the clip-clop of the horses' hooves, and the marvelous blaring of the trumpets on the armed guard behind. It was the most exciting scene. And then to see the French, the blasé French really, erupting with joy and surprise as this handsome young couple appeared. their faces were rather lethargic, and then you could just see the excitement ignite as the car drove by and the fantastic reaction. And she made such a hit that first appearance that people lined the streets all the way for her car whenever they knew what route she was taking. She even pulled a bigger crowd than he did. And he laughed about it and was said that he should be jealous of it, but was so very, very proud of her and of the marvelous way she handled herself, because she was with so many, really such older people all of the time, and pros who had been, well, Madame de Gaulle has been in this kind of life for so many years, and yet her regality and her presence and her poise were far more marked than Madame de Gaulle or Madame Vanier in Canada or any of the official ladies anywhere we went. I remember in Vienna, Jackie's enormous sensitivity to the person involved. In this case, it was Madame Khrushchev at the Palazzo. I think it was Palazzo Ruspoli or Rucellai in Vienna, where the daughter of the president of Austria, Frau Scharf, gave a luncheon for Mrs. Khrushchev, Mrs. Kennedy, and herself. The crowds in the Platz outside the palace window kept calling for Jackie, Jackie, Jackie. So Mrs. Kennedy walked to the window, this open window, and smiled and waved regally, and the crowd erupted, and the noise was tremendous. Then she realized that Mrs. Khrushchev was, after all, a co-guest, and she was very embarrassed about the fact that nobody was calling for Mrs. Khrushchev. So she did a very smart, cagey thing. She went over to Mrs. Khrushchev and said, "They want to see you too," and took her to the window. And Mrs. Khrushchev waved, and the two women stood there together. Well, it was a classic picture, and the crowd erupted again and applauded and so forth. But it meant a lot to Mrs. Khrushchev, and
a lot to her husband's work at that time.
It meant a lot to her husband's work, and the president, undergoing a great strain on that trip, that meeting with Khrushchev, had still a sense of history, and he wanted the sofa in Ambassador Matthews' house where he had sat, and he and Khrushchev had sat and had one of their hardest contents discussion. He wanted that sofa, and it's part of his museum. So we asked the ambassador if we couldn't have it, and FBO sent the ambassador another one, and President Kennedy came in possession of that sofa. But he had that kind of a historic recollection that was so precious.
Tish, was he very preoccupied on the trip about his meeting with Khrushchev? This was his first meeting with him as a relatively new young president, with an old and experienced and very hardened politician. Did you, those of you who were in the entourage, feel that he was deeply engrossed, looking forward to this, and at the time tense over it?
Yes, I think he was. I think even all through Paris, he was thinking about this meeting in Vienna. The chips were down, and I think he was probably very disappointed. The men on the west side are much more capable of discussing that than I am, but there was no question that he was preoccupied and disappointed in an emotional way. And she was intensely interested in all the political successes of his career and reflected it also herself.
So that you feel that in the sense that there was teamwork, in the sense that she was interested in what he was negotiating, as well as the
no question
complex mechanics of public appearances.
No question about it, and this is the great failure of her image, I think, her real image in the American public. The American public conceives of her as a wonderful wife and mother, which she was and is, and as a beautiful, poised young woman of artistic talent, which she is. They also conceive of her as someone who hates politics and hates politicians, and no, I don't mean hate, that's too strong a word.
Probably not very interested.
Has a distaste for it. And in actual fact, although she doesn't like things like political conventions and political meetings and so forth, in actual fact, She is such a bright, intelligent person. She very definitely shared his opinions and interrogated him as to what was going on. She was abreast of what was going on, and she helped him. She would write letters to heads of state, friendly, social, chatting letters when things were going wrong. And of course, it used to drive us wild over in the East Wing because we didn't have carbon copies and we didn't know what she was saying. She would write handwritten letters. It would go on for pages and pages and pages to General de Gaulle and Prime Minister Nehru and all of this. But this was her working with him upstairs and seeing how she could help in her way to further the political gains of the United States of America in its foreign policy. Now, I'm sure no other First Lady has ever done that, and I'm sure no other president has dared let his wife do that. And I hope that history will someday unearth those famous letters.
This was her own brand of personal diplomacy, if you will, then.
Her own brand of personal diplomacy, which she worked out with the president. So they really, she was intensely interested in foreign affairs.
Tish, tell me, was Mrs. Kennedy's trip to Pakistan and India part of a plan here? Was there something behind this other than just a sightseeing trip to the Far
yes.
East?
The president, having seen the enormous success of her trips abroad, realized that she could do a big job for him in that part of the country, whereas he could not spare the time at this particular time of the year, or this particular year, and he felt that it was an important area that needed attending to. So that trip was very difficult on everybody concerned. It was a tough, hard trip.
Wasn't it, Tish, at one point?
Yes, her health became bad, and it was postponed. Well, it was postponed for political reasons first, because of the elections, the Indian elections. There were many postponements. It was a jinx trip, and then she got sick. I was in Rome, ready to leave for Pakistan, when she called and said, I'm going to be 2 weeks late, and I have to cut off a whole part of my schedule again. And of course, I was delighted, because to sit in Rome for 2 more weeks was
no pain.
all I needed. But that was one of the worst experiences of my life, because when you move abroad with the president and the Air Force Jet 1, you move with a wonderful staff equipped to do everything. You've got medical, you've got communications, you've got enough Secret Service, you've got secretaries and mimeo machines. When Mrs. Kennedy took that trip, it was as though the President of the United States were going. There was no question about it. And yet, our staff was minimum. I had no secretary. I was all alone. I had 2 Secret Service men to hold my hand, and 2 combo signal corps operators wherever I went. And the troubles we had getting things done, the embassy staffs were not equipped to take care of us. And I didn't go to bed for 4 weeks. I've never been through such a nightmare in my life. I never got out of New Delhi, because the logistics of planning her movements, radio operators back and forth, changes of plans and schedules, movement of people, movement of bottled water, even that became an absolute crisis in our lives. And of course, so many funny things happened that are funny now and were so disastrous at the time. I remember I ordered 45 presidential seal, dark blue leather cowhide frames for India for the various officials there. I squeezed out of the embassy a list of the people who, really all of the people whom she would ever have to give a picture to. They're great picture lovers over there. Then I got them all signed in advance by her.
A picture of Mrs. Kennedy
Mrs.
herself.
Kennedy.
Yes.
And in some cases, Mrs. Kennedy and the President together, and I got them both to sign it. I was so proud of all my advance planning. Had them all cut, had the frames made to fit the various sizes of pictures, because they were all different sizes. Different sizes for different officials, and got the whole thing shipped out with New Delhi knowing exactly what was coming in the trunk and so forth. And 3 days before I was to arrive in New Delhi, and 7 days before she was to come back through to make her official arrival, I was sitting in Karachi trying to get some sleep. Sitting is right. And I was called to the radio again. It was one of the officials at the embassy in New Delhi. They had just then opened the trunk.
Oh, Tish.
And they had just then seen the frames, and they had just then come to the realization that, of course, cowhide won't do in India. The sacred cow, you can't, it's an offense. You cannot give leather. Oh, I let out a few swear words over the two-way radio, which I'm sure they're still trying to decode in Lebanon, Jordan, and some of these other countries in the Southeast Asia and the Middle East. But the upshot of it all was that I got on the radio and called one of our agents in Rome, and I just said, I don't care what you do, whether you have to buy out the whole silver store, but you'll have to get 45 frames made of the following measurements, silver in silver. Luckily, Italian silver was very cheap and only came up in price to the cost of these leather cowhide frames, which we were able to use other places later. But nevertheless, we had a real crisis on our hands, and all of the pictures had already been wrapped in White House wrappings with the gold and silver seals on them, and the cards written with script, the envelopes with the man's name and his title in script. The amount of work that was undone by that one little radio call is enough to put me in the hospital just thinking about it. Now I can laugh about it, but that's typical of what happened. And the trip was not without hitches. There were things that went wrong on it, mistakes that were made, but all in all, the crowds she pulled were fantastic. The press was marvelous, the press both at home and, more importantly, in India and Pakistan. And there's no question that she did a great deal of good for our relationships between the countries. And she did smart things like presenting the Children's Art Carnival from the Museum of Modern Art to New Delhi, things like that, which are permanent, lasting memorials to the American people, but which have the Kennedy name on it, and they remember the great lady who came, and the children all know who she is. It's very important that we continue to export our top ladies, first ladies, in this way.
A role all their own, I'm sure. Tish, you're mentioning the picture frames made me look at a little note here on my tablet which says Tiffany calendars. Now there's a story behind that I would love to hear.
The day the Cuban crisis on the long-range missiles, the famous October of 1962, the weary president called me over to his office, and he said, I have been thinking, none of these people have gone to bed. They have all stayed by my side during these 11 days. I think it was 11 days. My memory is so bad. And I want to record this event somehow for them. I want to give them a present which will remind them of how much it meant to me to have them sticking by me. And he said, I want you to see if Tiffany's will make a calendar, and I've already designed it, which would be a paperweight, and which would be a slab of silver, and then he sketched it out for me. He drew the month of October, the way any ordinary calendar would have October, 1963. Then he put his initials at the top with the initials of the man who would be getting the calendar. And then he put all the numbers in the month in, and then he drew a big circle around those 11 famous days. I hope it was 11. Well, let's call it 11.
Very near it. You remember he came back from a campaign speech on the 20th of October, supposedly with a cold. It was announced that way in the press.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until that was on the 20th, and it wasn't until the end of the month that Khrushchev finally capitulated, or at least the work was actually stopped on the Soviet bases, and that he promised to dismantle them. So you had a very close to 10 days there.
Right. Well, those were the days that he wanted to outline in some way. So I went to Tiffany's on the phone and had the silver department draw up a sketch, and they changed it several times, and of course the price was exorbitant in relation to the number of people. He wanted to give it to some 40 people, including people like his secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, and the head of the coding department, people who really have been slaving on this crisis. And of course the cabinet who was involved, in it, and people like George Bundy, and people who just didn't go to bed. So the price, this is a custom-made job, all hand engraved. With Tiffany's would have to make a wood blocking on it. The whole thing came to something like $40, $45. And you multiply that times 40 coming out of his own pocket, that's a lot of scratch in anyone's language. So he said, this is just too much. too much. Let's get it done lucite. Let's get a little thing of silver, put in a lucite thing that can sit on their desk. He loved all those lucite paperweights, which I think are simply horrible. I said, I think they're simply horrible. They're cheap and cheesy. And he said, well, I didn't ask your opinion. I said, just find out how much Tiffany's would charge to do it in lucite. So Tiffany said, we will not work in lucite. We would never, not even for the President of the United States. We will not even in historic occasions such as this. We refuse to let down our store standards. We will not use that plastic material. Well, he was furious when he heard that. Absolutely furious. He got Len Billings to get orders and designs from something like 5 lucite companies, and he had them coming in from all directions. Everybody was giving him designs and prices, you know, $8 for this, $4 from another company. And he would call me up and report maliciously every single low price to me over the telephone. You see, that company you worked for, no, you've just been trying to sell us down the river to Tiffany's all this time, getting all the state gifts, they're a bunch of robbers, on and on. Well, finally, one night, it was a Saturday night, at midnight, I had just finally hit the sack, exhausted. There was a telephone call from Camp David. It's the President of the United States himself saying, I have thought this whole thing over, and you're absolutely right. The Tiffany thing is so much better looking. It's so much more lasting. It's so much better taste. Get a hold of them and tell them to make them right away. So he'd been trying to save quite a few bucks, but his better nature got the best of him. He knew darn well. And he was so proud of those calendars. He gave each one personally to each person. And of course they bound it up together and gave him one back in Vermeil, which he treasured.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And it's sitting on everybody's desk to this day, and I'm sure one of their most cherished possessions.
Tish, I think I interrupted you when you were explaining to me about the circle on the calendar at the end of the 10-day period.
Oh, well, this was of course to make it leap out at you, and Tiffany's finally persuaded him to have the numbers come up much stronger and bigger and blacker in the engraving, much thicker engraving. So he finally agreed to that, and that's the way the final design is. But I think for a man as busy as he is, as he was, with as many things on his mind, to take the time and trouble to work out something like this, to show the people who were with him during those gruesome days, really shows the measure of the man.
He was appreciative of the tremendous effort that this meant for other people and the anxieties.
And he had imagination. Yeah. And when he had the Harvard dinner, the Harvard overseers, the Board of Overseers, he sent me a special memo saying, be sure, this is a very special evening. I don't want just a plain stag dinner. This has really got to be special. He really cared so much about that. And so we had a very special menu and the finest wines. We had crimson and white flowers on the table. And we got a little silver gifts. He wanted a little silver memento engraved for each one of the overseers. And of course I was dying to let into the dining room a big fat bulldog that I had knowledge of in Washington with an Eli blanket over him in the middle of dinner, but didn't have the courage. And it's a good thing I didn't, because one of the overseers had a heart attack in the middle of the dinner, and they would have blamed that on the bulldog.
Heavens. Tish, was the President's devotion to Harvard something that he had intended to put in his plans? I mean, had he arranged to have his museum at Cambridge? Was this done before his death or not? I don't recall.
Yes, I think he'd already picked out the land in October, the month before. The month before he was assassinated. And I don't know whether that's the land they're going to use, because I think they need more space. I read in the papers, but he did survey a site in October when he was there. He had great devotion to Harvard. The guest list, he tried to insert as many professors, as old professors, as possible on the guest list. Give them a free meal. But the guest list, he went over them with a fine-tooth comb. Mrs. Kennedy would go over them, and she would make changes and additions and suggestions. And then the president always changed everything around again. He was very interested in who came. And then every night before dinner, when he was taking his bath or shaving, he'd call through the bathroom door for me, and I had many conversations around the corner. I sat in a chair sometimes around the corner and briefed him on who all was coming. And he wanted to know all of the little all of the little non-essential information that fascinated him, and he would catch me short. Once when we had Aaron Copland and Samuel Barber, he really didn't know who they were, and I said, well, they're the most famous contemporary American composers. And he said, all right, give me the names of all of their operas and their symphonies and where they've been performed. And I said, well, Mr. President, I can't. He said, you just said they were the most famous contemporary composers. I mean, how can you make a statement like that if you can't back it up? I pulled Vanessa out of the hat for Samuel Barber, but he used it. I mean, anything that I would tell him about any of the guests, they'd go down the receiving line, he'd say, oh, you're the famous composer of this and that. Well, he just absolutely flattered them to death. If somebody had been Mrs. Kennedy's old dressmaker, he would get that, the name would be put in his brain before the receiving line, and he would say, I hear you made the most beautiful clothes, and why aren't you making any now? I'm sure your bill would be cheaper. And this sort of thing, it just charmed them to death. So he really spent time on the guest list. The extraneous names that, were not government officials or politicians. He really wanted to know why that person was there, and we had to be able to defend everybody on the guest list.
Well, Tish, when the man is so pressed that he takes briefings while in the tub, whenever was there time for him with his family? What was his recreation? How could he create a life?
He combined, after all, the children could be playing all over him, and he could still be conducting a conference or writing a speech or anything. On the weekends, he got away with his wife and children. He absolutely closed the door, and never on his official life, because he was working the whole time, even when he was with them, but he closed the door on the official people around him. He got back to his family, and at dinner time he was with his family, and even often at lunchtime. And so that he spent more time with his wife and children in the White House than he ever had before, and than most men ever have a chance to. But he did have a double-track mind. He really could pay attention to them and to his work at the same time. He could talk on the telephone and be playing with the children. He could talk on the telephone and be also talking to Mrs. Kennedy about something entirely different at the same time. It's just extraordinary. It's a double track. But the children were great relaxation, and he was so proud of the way they looked and their behavior, their good manners, and he was so proud of Mrs. Kennedy being able to run a house of distinction and to be able to raise children of distinction too. He was such a perfectionist. If something had been wrong with those children, or something basically wrong with the house, it would have upset him very much. He would demand that it would be changed and rectified immediately.
Well, were the Kennedy cousins in and out of the house much? Was there ever a feeling that it was a family house in the sense that family came and went?
Oh yes, the movie theater was used constantly, and the children were in and out. Caroline's, of course, played morning school. He would be up there seeing the children constantly. He would go out on the south lawn and play with them and interrupt their play session and talk to them. And they'd all trip into his office at a drop of a hat whenever he gave the signal. So the house was full of children, full of the noise of children, morning, noon, and night. You never knew what avalanche of young people would suddenly be bearing down on you. Running noses and dropped mittens in the hall and bicycles. And of course, Caroline's birthday party, he would always come to that. And he was fascinated by the clinging monkey we had in one of her clinging monkey that the Baltimore Zoo sent over. And I had an ambassador in my office who had just come to discuss a foreign state visit of his head of state. And the trainer from the zoo only knew my office. He didn't know any other place in the White House. So he came in with a monkey in its diaper, and his diaper had to be changed right in my office, which horrified the ambassador. But the president was fascinated by that monkey and wanted to know why it clinged and clung and how, and all of it. He had this curiosity that anything that was unusual, he immediately had to get right to the bottom of it. So Caroline's activities often gave him, again, a little relaxation from the world affairs of state.
Well, Tish, how often did he get away to Cape or to Newport, or did he just take business with him when he went?
Oh, he always took business with him.
No.
But to get away from the White House, something his father always said to him, get away from the White House. Put many miles between yourself and the Washington seen, otherwise you'll never have any objective picture of it. And Ambassador Kennedy used to say that to all of us. We get all tense and just get away, you know, the whole world doesn't revolve around Washington, D.C., the whole world revolves around the world. And the president had a much fresher outlook, I'm sure, when he was relaxing in the sun, relaxing in the country. But he always had work with him and people coming out to see him and his appointments going on as usual.
Tish, Ambassador Kennedy was stricken the same winter that Mrs. Kennedy went off to India, and I think at one point there was talk of postponing her trip then. Was that a very deep blow to the president? Was he very shocked and startled by this, or had the ambassador been in ill health?
No, he'd been in great health, and it was a terrible blow. Because although Ambassador Kennedy was never around the White House, he was on the other end of the telephone often with his son. And the two men loved each other deeply, and this was a terrible blow. And the president suddenly became the head of the family for the first time. And now Attorney General Kennedy is, and it's just, it's amazing that the succession has passed so rapidly from man to man in this short span of time, when it was such a healthy, happy, strong family. No, the ambassador stayed away, never got in anyone's hair, but he was a source of delight to us all and comfort to us all. We loved him. The very few times he ever come to the White House, he always came over to the East Wing to see lay girls, as he called us. He always brought us gallons of ice cream because he knew we were great eaters. And we'd bring over lots of spoons and several gallons. He was on the board of some ice cream company. He got some super deluxe kind of ice cream. He put it on the Caroline and bring it down to us, and then watch all of his girls eating ice cream with spoons out of the same gallon jars. He had a great pixie sense of humor, and
which seems to have been inherited from some of the stories you've told today.
Oh yes, and his demise was a great blow to the president, no question about it. Because the ambassador was never afraid to say anything. He would say anything. He was the most outspoken man I ever knew in my life. It's kind of nice. Once he just said, when I had been in trouble, I can't remember what it was, I was in trouble so often. He just said, oh, there's only one piece of advice that I have to give you. If you follow it, you're going to be all right. And I said, what was that? Ambassador Kennedy, he said, tell them all to go to hell. So that's the kind of man he was, and the president needed that kind of wonderful, relaxing quality from his father.
Clearly a wonderful bucker-upper, from
yes.
ice cream to...
Yes, he was.
But Tish, the president's mother at various times acted as hostess
That's
too.
Right. That's right. She did a wonderful job. She's an old pro at it, having been ambassadress to London and having been in official life off and on a good many years. And she loved it, and she always was radiant and beautiful and did a very good job.
Indeed.
One thing that was very exciting was his influence on youth, because there's never been a president who influenced the world more, who gave more hope to young people who wanted to think about politics and government than this young president. And he showed a tremendous affinity for youth. We had all these youth concerts on the White House lawn, and Mrs. Kennedy would often not be there. She was away or having a baby or something, and the president took over, and he gave a marvelous speech each time to all the children on the lawn and to the musicians. He would dig up facts and statistics about music students and how many jobs they could get later on. He really inspired them all tremendously, and he did his famous phrase each time. He couldn't sit through the whole concert, he didn't have the time, but he would say, winter, summer, spring, and fall, I'm leaving my door open, my office door open, so that I can hear the whole concert. And he always would. So the children would be playing away on the south lawn to an audience of children, and they knew the president was listening. So that was very sweet. And anytime we had anything for embassy children inside the house, he always made it a point to come over. And I'll never forget the time the Così fan tutte Young Metropolitan Opera Guild performers were in the state dining room. They had just performed the opera, and here were all these MC children, and there was a whole group of them about 9 and 10 years old from Southeast Asia and Africa in their foreign dress, cute as buttons. The president was over there talking to them, and one of the stars of the performance wore a great turban with large, towering ostrich feathers. And his large, towering ostrich feathers went right into the lit candles on the wall sconces and burst forth into a towering mass of flames. Well, these children, it was quickly extinguished, but it was such a shock and so surprising that some of the little children started to cry. And the president was standing there with them, and he put his arms around them and burst out laughing, because there was no more danger. The fire was out, the man wasn't injured in any way. It's just his ostrich feathers just went up in smoke. But those little children on the side of the president laughing and laughing so that they could start laughing. Then the whole room started to laugh, showed how really great he was with them. I say they all adored him.
Well, Tish, is there anything else that comes to mind here that you want to mention? I had particularly wanted to ask you at the conclusion of the interview to tell a little bit about coming back for the absolutely unbelievable event of the funeral of President Kennedy and your role there after.
Well, my role primarily was to work on the ceremonial part. Mrs. Kennedy wanted the Black Watch because the president had loved the Black Watch so much, and they performed for the children just a few weeks previously. So I got the head of the Black Watch out of bed down in Nashville, Tennessee, or someplace like that, where they were performing. And he said, of course they would come up, they would all come up. But it was a question of just getting the absolute requirement number to look well and to make the right amount of noise with their bagpipes. And so I worked on that with the British Embassy, getting them up, their transportation, and so forth. The British Embassy, I must say, was wonderful and very cooperative. And the Black Watch was very thrilled about coming. Then it was a question of my role was ceremonial. Sergeant Shriver set up headquarters in Ralph Dunban's office, and I worked directly under Sarge, hopefully to implement some of Mrs. Kennedy's desires in the funeral ceremony. She wanted this to be done to absolute perfection, exactly as the president would have done it for somebody he loved very much, or somebody who was very important in the United States. And the way in which it was done so fast and efficiently and beautifully was one of the greatest memories any of us will ever have. The family moved like clockwork. Teddy took over the Kennedys in Hyannisport, his mother and his father and Eunice and so forth. The Attorney General took charge of Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. John F. Kennedy, and Sergeant Shriver took charge of the mechanical arrangements at the funeral. It was the most marvelous interweaving of responsibilities, each person knowing what he had to do.
I mean, in a time of tragedy and crisis, the whole staff and the family was galvanized into
action. Everybody had his role. It's really marvelous to see it work. Since the president, we all knew the president loved ceremony and military pomp. I've said that many times, and everybody else will say it many times too. Everybody wanted this to be the greatest military ceremonial thing in the world, and I honestly think it was. He loved the Black Watch, and Mrs. Kennedy requested that the Black Watch be there, and they were. I woke the head of the Black Watch up in some place like Nashville, and he got the proper amount of men, and we had a lot of trouble getting them up on airplanes and getting them there at the right time. They were performing every night on the road, so it was not easy for them to suddenly interrupt everything when they had tickets sold, full houses. But they managed. We figured out the scenario of who would walk where, what, and how, and I was in meetings with military leaders and Sergeant on this. Then nobody remembered the president's own, the redcoats, the colonial troops, whom the president loved very much. So I said they've got to be there, and we put them at the base of Arlington, in that green lawn apse, so that as the cars came across the bridge, they came right up, the Revolutionary soldiers standing at attention.
And these were the same soldiers who were on the lawn of
Who
Mount
had,
Vernon.
who had fired at the press in the President of Pakistan's state dinner at Mount Vernon. And then they had arranged in their basic plan for the Army band and the Navy band, I forget which, to be at the graveside. And knowing how Mrs. Kennedy would feel about that, I went against all the general's orders and put the Marine band there, because after all, the Marine band is the president's band. They play in the White House every night, every party or function he has, so of course he'd want them there for the real use of the band. So they played it at the graveside, and I think the thing that really killed us all at the end was the Air Force One jet going over. That really. But Mrs. Kennedy crashed through with the greatest amount of strength and dignity that any woman in public life has ever shown, I think, in a moment of tragedy. And this is just sort of her last really great tribute to him and her role, and just as he would have wanted it. And I think the dignity of the whole family, the way they comported themselves, and the way everything ran was not only a tribute to John F. Kennedy, the man, but also a tribute to the United States of America, because in the eyes of the world, we look pretty shoddy having our president assassinated in Dallas. But I think the way the funeral was handled, the way everybody acted, suddenly just put Americans back up again in the minds of people around the world.
I think one of the most impressive things was Mrs. Kennedy's consenting to receive the leaders of various countries at the White House after the funeral.
Yes, this was a great show of strength on her part, because she really should have been allowed to give in long before and to have to suddenly be hostess again. But it was her last time to be hostess, and she wanted to do it well. And these were the people who were very important to him and to our country. So it was a terrible chapter to end John F. Kennedy's rule in the White House, but it was certainly, no one could possibly criticize it for dignity and rightfulness, which is what he wanted.
Well, Tish, it seems a long way from that beautiful winter morning to the quiet days in the end with the rain falling and the casket draped in black in the East Room. Such a change from many of the brilliant parties you participated in. And I want to thank you for coming all the way from Chicago for the interview. And I really appreciate your bringing to life for us and for future listeners a very brilliant and dynamic person for whom, obviously, as you talk, it was a joy for you to work.
Well, it was a great thrill, Anne, to do this. Much more could be said, but I think that's enough for now. It doesn't give them years here.
Well,
When it will be, when it can be released.
well, when you get your transcript, what you do is then write back with your specifications, you see, and they have to have this waiting so that then they can do it.
Oh, but you can't.
I hold this
can't
until the
specify.
transcript
All right.
comes in. I have another
Good.
that
Today is what date, do you know?
26th. Yeah.
Accepted.
Tish, today I wonder if you could summon up more memories of various events in the White House. You recall that when we closed last time, um, you said there were so many more things to tell. I'm sure none of us can ever tell all the things when they've lived that intense and packed 2.5 years, but I would like very much today to have you recall some of the little events that we simply didn't have time to get to last time.
Well, there have been so many little events, but I'll try and remember a couple more. One was that when we first heard the Prince and Princess of Monaco were coming to lunch, I had always jokingly called Prince Rainier Prince Reindeer, and I referred to him in all of my conversations with the President as Prince Reindeer and Princess Grace, and even in my memos. And after the luncheon, the President stopped me in the hall, and he was laughing, and he said, "For heaven's sakes, Tish, don't do that to me again." And I said, "What?" And he said, consistently call somebody like Prince Rainier Prince Reindeer, because at one point in today's lunch I turned him and called him Prince Reindeer. He was laughing about it, but I think underneath it all he was a little bit angry, and I don't blame him. Then another time he got amused angry at me was early in the game when he gave a state luncheon for the President of Finland and Madame Kekkonen. Mrs. Kennedy was down in Florida at the time, so he asked me to be the hostess. It was a great thrill to do this, of course, and since it was so early in the game, he'd forgotten procedure and protocol, and he forgot to stand up and raise a toast. So I looked at him and tried to catch his eye and pointed to the glass. He didn't quite understand it, and finally I wrote on the back of my place card, "You're supposed to toast." So he rose to his feet and announced ceremoniously that the social secretary informs me I'm supposed to make a toast. He laughed about that, but actually we were half an hour behind schedule, and I felt I was being a little presumptuous to give orders to the President like that, but it was necessary.
Well, Tish, I think that anyone who ever saw him always sensed that laughter was very close there, that this was a person with a great deal of wit and humor.
Always a great sense of humor about everything. His curiosity and interest in things was always couched in a frame of reference of good humor and fun. He was always seeking to find the funny things, always wanted to know the latest jokes, and always wanted to know any funny repartee that anybody had heard anywhere. He had to be in on it, because he often said that he felt so cut off from his former outside life of conviviality and seeing people in a relaxed way, that he liked to have it brought into his official life whenever possible. He used to question us about New York. When he'd heard that some of us had been into New York for a weekend, he'd question us all about the theater and the latest restaurants, and was the food still as good at Le Pavillon and places like that. Great longing, I think, for some of his former life. I remember when President and Mrs. Truman came to dinner, he wanted to do something after dinner for President Truman that would really please him. And he thought a great deal about it, and he changed his mind. I can't remember some of the things that he decided to do, entertainment, movies, various things. Finally, he threw them all down the drain because he heard that a man named Eugene List used to play the piano for Harry Truman a lot. He said, "What would be fun to get him back?" And evidently Truman hadn't heard him play for many, many years, but we got him down from New York. And after dinner, Eugene List did sit down and play, and Harry Truman had tears in his eyes. And then Harry Truman sat down and played. President Kennedy said, "Now we've got to hear from the real musician." And evidently President Truman played all night long until practically 1 o'clock in the morning.
Good heavens, I didn't realize his talent went beyond the Missouri wall.
No, he really enjoyed that, but he told President Kennedy that he had given him a really delightful evening, and the Kennedys felt that it was a great success, having someone who was out of Harry Truman's past.
Of course, this again shows his sensitivity to other people and what would make an event pleasing for them that I think we talked about the last time.
Yes, it's so true. And, then I remember the congressional reception after the first year, he remembered very vividly for the next year. He said, I didn't want to speak to you about it last year, but I tasted the punch, and it was so god-awful that if we want to have any friends left in Congress, for Pete's sakes, do something about it. So I said, all right, Mr. President, but the only way we can do something about it that will please you, really, is to have you come and taste it. So darned if he didn't come down into the butler's pantry, down in the kitchen, on the ground floor kitchen, after an official lunch. One day we had Charles the butler and Renee the cook, myself and a couple of other people, and we all tasted various concoctions of punches. And he really didn't like any of them, but he said finally, after tasting about 6 different brews and trying to judge it, he said, I suppose if you drink enough of this stuff, you find you don't know what it's tasting like after all anyway. But he said, let's try it a little harder. So the next day we tried a little harder and sent him up a tiny bit at the end of his lunch that day. And he said, now this is it. This will do. So the first person he asked someone like Senator Dirksen, I can't remember who it was, what he thought of the punch that night. And whoever, the senator in question, said, it's quite undrinkable, Mr. President. The President referred this to me again and said, I guess it's all a matter of taste.
The Kennedy recipe for punch was not that
Yes,
successful.
we never did succeed. We never got the proper texture and the proper recipe. I hope in the future administrations they do.
Well, Tish, you mentioned so much of the care and thought that the President gave to his formal functions. I think one of the most outstanding functions during his administration was the Emancipation Proclamation reception. I believe this is the first time that such a function has been held, the first time that the White House
Gave a reception really for the Negro people.
Yes, exactly.
Really, that's what it really was.
Negroes of distinction and achievement to
That's right.
celebrate this.
And the leaders, all of the Negro leaders. Yes, he had to that reception a lot of the Negroes who had really been vilifying him and criticizing him for not going far enough in civil rights. He invited all of them, and he invited the cabinet. He very carefully invited all of the top officials and saw to it that they were there. And he spent a whole 2 hours at that party, and he watched all of the preparations for it very carefully.
Well,
It
Tish,
really meant a lot to him.
the President and the Attorney General were both very deeply involved in the whole civil rights issue at that time. This must have been a very significant effort.
Yes, he thought he brought it into the White House activities as often as possible. It was because of him that Grace Bumbry came and sang, the great Negro soprano. She was the first Negro artist of this caliber to sing in the White House, except for Marian Anderson. And Grace Bumbry was an unknown in America, really. She hadn't even made her debut. But this was a great thing for the Negro people, for Negro musicians, when her first chance in the United States of America came right in the White House. She was very emotionally pleased by that, as you can well imagine.
As I recall that reception, the President elected not to stand in a receiving line, but simply to mingle with his guests. Is this a pattern that he adopted frequently?
Well, they decided, President and Mrs. Kennedy decided very early in the administration that it's better not to have a receiving line if you have over 300 people, because they're going to stand in line forever and ever and ever, and nobody's ever going to get into the house. So we just abandoned the receiving line, and they walked amongst all their guests. Everybody this way got served drinks and food, and there wasn't a great long snaky line right out into the driveway. Sometimes they'd wait a whole 2 hours before they could get in to be received by the President. And if somebody's very old and tottering, this is awfully hard on them. People used to faint and everything else, waiting in the receiving line. So it made things much more comfortable. A lot of people complained, but the people who complained were just talking off the top of their heads to be antagonistic, and they're the people who complain about everything anyway. So
Always someone who does.
it was a successful formula. The President loved my telling him Bernard Baruch's remark. And some press lady said, but Mr. Baruch, you have no social secretary and you entertain so much. How do you cope with the protocol? And he said, I don't have any protocol in my household. Those who matter don't mind, and those who mind don't matter. And President Kennedy loved that. He used to quote him on many an occasion. The night the night of the state dinner of the Shah of Iran, he twitted Mrs. Kennedy by saying, "You better watch out, Jackie, you better watch out, see what kind of jewels are going to come out. You better put on all your jewels." So she was borrowing jewels like mad from everybody right and left, trying to come up to Her Royal Highness the Shah Hansa and Farah Diba, or whatever her name was. And finally, Mrs. Kennedy did a very crafty thing. She took off all of her jewels and just put one jewel in her hair and was totally unjeweled. And of course, Farah arrived with the Shah in a gold embroidered dress glittering with sequins, and every jewel in the kingdom, the whole Iranian kingdom, on her back, front, and head. And the president just kept laughing at his wife and pointing and saying, "You know, are you sure you did the right thing?" And of course she had done the right thing. It was very clever, her wearing no jewels at all.
No competition with Oriental jewelry.
But the president was very cute, because he kept saying, "You know, she's pretty good looking, Jackie, and that dress is pretty good. Bet her clothes bill is more than yours."
Did the president enjoy the sensation that Mrs. Kennedy caused, the sensation in the popular press because of her good looks, her lovely clothes? Was he aware of this? Was he interested in her clothes, or did he leave
yes.
that very much for her
Well,
to choose?
he left it up to her, of course, but he always commented whether he liked it or not. He was very proud of her taste. He loved beautiful clothes. He didn't love all the publicity she got for being a clothes horse, nor did she. She hated all of this attention and asking her how much this cost and how many things she ordered and from where. She just wanted to be well dressed and not have people asking all those questions, and I don't blame her one bit.
Not prepared for the insatiable curiosity of the press and the doubly insatiable
Exactly.
curiosity of the woman's page, I suppose.
Exactly.
Did the president have any favorite colors or effects that he particularly liked?
No, there were certain dresses that he liked very, very much. He loved the orange skirt and the black velvet top, French evening gown she had, and then also the Oleg Cassini one with the pink and silver lace was a Dior fabric, which she wore to President and Madame de Gaulle's reception in Versailles, and she also wore it for a state dinner in Washington. He very much liked that dress and told her to wear it often, and she did as a result. She was very sensitive to his likes and dislikes in clothes. He used to be fascinated by all the logistics of our entertainment in the East Room after the state dinners. And when we had a very ambitious ballet, we had the American Ballet Theater, Billy the Kid. He said, "Well, how are you going to get all that symphony music? It's very important." And we said, "We're going to have to use it on tape, Mr. President." So he said, "Well, what if the tape machine breaks?" And we said, "Oh, we're prepared for that. The Signal Corps has two machines going at once, and if one breaks down, then the other one takes over." So, in the middle of the performance, one of the electricians put on an extra trooper light, and as a result, all of the fuses in the ballroom blew, and both tape recorder machines burst. And the music stopped, and the dancers froze exactly as they were, and all of the lights were off. I died 1,000 deaths. And when finally the electricity went on again, the dancers were in their exact position in which they stopped. It was a miracle. And they went right on again, and the president turned to his guest, the president of the Ivory Coast, and said, "Of course, you see, Mr. President, that's all part of our ballet." And the president of the Ivory Coast thought so. He took it in and thought that was exactly what was supposed to happen. It was a dramatic effect. And then the president came to me afterwards and said, "You may think you have all of these scientific problems figured out, Tish, but you don't. Don't let that happen again. We don't like sitting in the dark in the middle of our entertainment. At least have an accordionist there, somebody to entertain when all the lights go out and all the music stops." Another thing that endeared him to us was his marvelous respect for elderly people, and elderly people who have accomplished a lot in their lives. I think this was his, probably sparked by his own respect for his father. But he organized a beautiful little reception for Florence Jaffrey Hurst Harriman, Daisy Harriman, who'd been our minister to Norway and was caught there by World War II and achieved herself, disposed of her duties with great distinction. The president had a special citation made for her and designed, and he made him the most marvelous, touching speech. And he really did it because of his father, because Daisy Harriman had known very well Ambassador Kennedy, and he realized that when people get older and they have never been really recognized properly in their lives, and the government has never done anything for them, that this should be rectified before they die. And you could tell that Mrs. Harriman realized that this was the high point in her whole life before her death. And she kept saying, Mr. President, I thought I was forgotten. I thought nobody remembered. I thought nobody cared. This was, without a doubt, the most exciting moment in her whole life. And I think it was wonderful of President Kennedy to think of it and to act on it and to do it. Another time which had us all highly emotional was the Congressional Medal of Honor winners reception. It was the annual military reception held in May, always held outside on the lawn. It was a beautiful day, and all the Congressional Medal of Honor winners had been brought back by the Army to Washington and had been bussed there, and there was a special reception for them in the Rose Garden ahead of time, and the President came out and spoke to them, and then the President said, now, I want my picture taken with every single one of them as a souvenir. Well, there were, I don't know how many, hundreds there. And he stood patiently with each one while a separate photograph was taken, which they could have to keep all of their lives. And he talked to the ones in wheelchairs, and he really ran the whole party. He decided all the ceremonial procedure himself, decided who would be what, where, and when. He ran that whole party himself because he thought it was going to be the most marvelous military reception we've ever had. It was the most meaningful one because of our guests. It was the first time they'd all been brought to the White House ever in the whole history of the Congressional Medal. So I guess that's it for now, Annie.
It's got a full revolution on it, just